You're listening to 4CRB's interviews and talkback series.
I'd like to welcome to the microphone Supreme Court Judge David Ashton Lewis.
Well, it's good to be back. I've been away. I've been in the United States speaking at a conference in Brigham Young University, which is the University of the Mormon people, of the Mormon faith, and it was in Provo, and Provo is the capital of Utah. And I had 4 days, and my eyes were opened to courtesy, politeness, genuinely, and I've got to say for all the listeners out there, the women were feminine, graceful, gracious, and serene. Dressed modernly, but you couldn't tell them difference from a modern woman on the Gold Coast. The men were masculine without being ugly masculine. They were gentlemen. They were courteous. They put the women first. The women did the same with the men. And not just their Mormons. I was treated like I was a prince. I was treated like I was a king by the Mormon men. And, of course, when I spoke, there was about 400 at this conference from all over the world. There were Muslims, there were Hindus, there were Sikhs, there were Jews, there were Coptic Church, Greek Orthodox Church, Russian Orthodox Church, Anglican, Roman Catholic. Now,
you better share with the listeners the topic, David.
I will, because I'm coming to that. And I had to go and speak on. I had an area that they wanted me to speak on the topic. But before I reveal it, on Sunday, all of us, there was about 52 guests, international guests. We were taken to the Mormon Tabernacle in the middle of Provo. This tabernacle seats 20,000 people. It's like a fifth the size of the MCG. And the Mormon Tabernacle Choir came out and sang. Well, they were magnificent.
It's a very big following in the States, the Mormons, isn't it?
Yes, it is, but I found out not only is it a big following in the United States, it has a huge following in Europe. I was in a team with a Finnish, a Muslim. His name was Atik Ali, and he was as less Middle Eastern looking, and I got the courage. We were in a team together, and I said, "You're Muslim and you're Finnish?" And he said, "Yes, I'm of Uzbek and Tajik background, because over the last 500-600 years, Uzbeks and Tajiks would trade from their part in southern Russia through Finland into Scandinavia, and they would sell fur mainly, but certain of their particular goods. And my family came into Finland in the 1700s, and we're as white as you are." And I said, "Yes, you are." And so I learnt about that. And although a Muslim, they are very close to the large Mormon population.
Okay.
So right, the name
topic.
of the topic. The topic was religious freedom as a major tool to establishing peace, world peace. And now I spoke on, and I had to speak for probably just over an hour, and then I had about 200 attended my session, and then they would ask questions. And you were in like great lecture halls at Brigham Young University, and by golly, if I ever had to go back to university, I'd certainly go there. It is a beautiful campus. They're very well funded, the Mormons, and we were all asked not to ask for an honorarium, that is pay, but they would fly us all from wherever in the world. They would fly us business class. We would be accommodated in first-class hotel accommodation. I was. The only thing is I've never really liked American food, so I lost 2 kilos. And I've put about 1 kilo of that back now. But the topic was religious freedom as a tool to establishing world peace. Now, the first thing you would think, and in my speech I said, it's rather ironic, isn't it, that two of the greatest causes of hatred and war are religion and love. And yet all religions, I said, oh look, I was presented with the 23 volumes of this Srimad Bhagavatam when I retired from the bench by the Indian Bar Association. And that really is the sum of all knowledge, written 7,000 years ago, and it contains the Upanishads, the Vedas, the Lokas, and the Brahma Lokas. And what they are is the ancient writings. The Bhagavad Gita is a really 450, 500-page summary of it. I said, look, I must confess, I've got halfway through the 23 volumes. But basically all religions do preach the same. And even though we have a difficulty in the West at the moment with Islam, I was presented by an Egyptian doctor of Islamic theology with a book which is alliterated. It's the Quran, and the bottom of each page it sets out how it relates to both the Old Testament and the New Testament. Very well written, co-written by an American orthopedic surgeon who's a Christian and a Dr. Safir Kaskas. And he'd heard me speak and said, sir, I really want to give you this. You strike me as definitely a man of the book. And I said, oh, well, I believe. And I know that Islam is receiving a terrible fate in the West because sadly it's been taken over by radicals. Just like if we'd been in Europe at the time of the Inquisition, the cruelty that
yes,
did, and
absolutely.
they were leading the charge. I said, the only thing that I find sad is the good. You're a doctor of Islamic theology, and I'm not in any way criticising you, but in my country, the good imams, you don't hear from them. It's always the radicals. And he said, well, we're hoping that this forum will do, and it did. I mean, it made me look at Islam in a very different light. So it was good in that. It was overwhelmingly successful with the concept of religion and peace. And I said, but we must always have to deal with fanatics.
Sure.
And there's fanatical Anglicans, there are fanatical Catholics, there are fanatical Orthodox, there are fanatical Sikhs.
And as with everything, the negative seems to
always rise to the top.
Well, it's the one that is publicised and is topical and gets the, oh my goodness gracious me comment.
And then what happens with that, there's not a lot of intellectual research. It's just as, oh, well, all Muslims are like this. All Christians are like this.
Like anything else, you can't paint everything with the same brush.
No, you can't. So, in short, to the listeners, and I say good morning to my son Somerset, and to Lynn, and to all the people who do listen, I say it was a successful conference. I've been invited, would I go and speak on international human rights? Brigham Young has a campus in Hawaii, and it's a beautiful campus, and I've been asked, would I be prepared to speak at that in Hawaii? And I said, yes, I would, because I flew 14 hours from Brisbane to Los Angeles, and then I had 2 hours to Salt Lake City, and then an hour drive from Salt Lake City to Provo. So I said, oh, look, I'd be very keen to come to that one because it'll only take me about 9 hours to get to Honolulu from Hawaii. But it's lovely when, and for those who have attended conferences listening today, I think you can relate to when a conference works and works well, they're a joy.
Look, my comment is that often you don't see religions mixing in a conference-type environment.
No.
It is, moreover, well, this is a Mormon discussion, this is a Christian discussion, this is Islamic discussion. So it's very interesting to see that a number of faiths were represented, and it was an open discussion, and obviously, like anything at a university and so forth, ideas were explored, whether they were controversial or not.
You have made a really good point there, Cole, that when you and I went to university, it was a place where we challenged the accepted.
Sure.
We looked for new ways. We debated with professors and everything, and now we're caught with this brain-killing political correctness that if you don't toe a particular line, you're cancelled.
Look, we always came to a lot of the discussions with no idea is a stupid idea. Now, the point being there is, look, sometimes they are blatantly stupid, and how could you be thinking that? But it does stimulate thinking. You have had to assess your views and opinions as well as other people's views and opinions and go, I reject that wholeheartedly.
Yes.
You're not, the stupid comment is, well, really I just don't see that flying. The point being, though, is we can have an open discussion without fear of being called racist or fear of being called a bigot or fear of called a religist. And have a discussion in an open forum and go, well, maybe we can move the ball forward. And that's the point.
Or we get and said, look, I've heard you and I do now have a clearer understanding of what you're saying, but I find I still don't agree with it.
Sure, we agree to disagree.
Yes, of course. So this is what this conference was like. But there was really no disagreement. What the conference fleshed out, it was the commonality of Christianity, of Islam, of Judaism, of Hinduism, of Sikhism, that there's a common thread and a common core in all of them that deals with the topic, love your neighbour, be peace. And so during my discussion, I drew the comparison between Judaism and Christianity and how Jesus in the marketplace was rather arrogantly attacked by the chief priest and the scribes and the Pharisees, and rather arrogantly Jesus was told, so you're going to do away with all the law and all the prophets. And I love Jesus' answer was, no, not one word of it. They still stand. If you want to follow me, and when I've raised this in my speech or my talk, if you want to follow me, that is, if you want to be a Christian, and I reminded everyone that up until Constantine and the battle at Milvian Bridge in 313, Christianity was a Jewish sect, was only for the Jews.
Sure.
And I reminded them that Jesus saying, if you want to follow me, there's really only two things you have to do. One, you have to love the Lord your God with all your soul, with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And the second is, and you shall love your fellow man the same, with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, and with all your strength. You leave the judging on that up to God. And I've said this before on the show. I feel uncomfortable with homosexuality, either male or female. But yet the godfather to my children was a homosexual man who I trusted, and so people would ask me, but if you feel uncomfortable, how did you vote in the referendum or the plebiscite for same-sex marriage? And I said, I voted against it. Not that I'm against homosexuality, but I wanted us brains and minds to come up with a totally equal relationship name, model, because marriage has been, not just John Howard, forget John Howard, but for thousands of years between a male and a female, not between a male and a male, but we've moved forward. So I, on a couple of speaking for us, said, come on, help me. We've got to call it, gender same-sex union with all the rights of marriage. So we talked about this there. And, of course, in Islam, radical Islam, they're put to death. And I was able to raise the Leviticus model in the Old Testament that it is an abomination for a man to lie with a man as with a woman, they shall be put to death. We now have transgenderism. And in there it speaks of, Leviticus, it is abomination for a man to dress in woman's clothing. Now look, that was just that time. I say we've now got to a state where we're prepared to accept that.
Look, everything has to evolve, and if we look at it, society's evolved. Well, if we really want to look at it from in a microcosm, in the 80s, homosexuality was a crime. But we've evolved now to a point where it's accepted and same-sex people can marry.
Yes.
So has religion got to evolve.
It does.
4CRB evolves. It can't just play the music that
You're
it
right.
played 20 years ago and expect to have the same audience because society has moved on. 50-year-olds, I was 30 when I started at 4CRB. I'm now 53.
Okay.
I'm starting to move into the music that I actually used to listen to, but, 20 years ago, I didn't know any of it.
No.
And could appreciate that there was a segment of the community that did appreciate it.
Well, can I add to that? You see, the Muslim man who I was with, he said, you're fortunate because Christianity has evolved.
Sure.
And you have now taken texts and said, well, 1,000 years ago, it was this. And I used the example, and he said, but the trouble with Islam in many places, it hasn't evolved. It's still strictly what was written in 600 AD. And I used an example and said, look, I'm a lawyer and a judge. When I was a young lawyer, well, before my time, as the 1920s, 30s in Australia, there was the death penalty for 22 different offences. We then moved the death penalty for treason and for intentional murder. We've now moved, we don't have the death penalty. So I think those second words of Jesus, you just love your fellow man, whether he's a murderer, whether he is gay, whether he's transgender. You leave the judging of that up to God. Because when man tends to judge, and I belong to a profession that everyone loves to kick in the head, when man tends to judge, it's very hard. Look, I struggle with this still, and I think I do a reasonable job. The case before me, and particularly on the Supreme Court, the case before me, David, your views, your feelings are irrelevant. Look at what the law says to this, and then apply the law as you see it. There comes a time where you've got to be subjective.
Sure.
But you've got to be humane, you've got to be kind, you've got to be sensible. And so that's why I think the ultimate judge being God, if you're a believer, is sensible. And what Atik said was, we have to start doing that. And he said one of the good things of Islam in the West is they will have to start doing that. You're not going to stone women who commit adultery and forget the man.
Sure.
And he said, I understand that you went through that. And we spoke about...
stoning the women?
The women caught in adultery in the marketplace.
Sure.
And I said it was amazingly obvious there was no man there. Where was the man she was committing adultery with? But it was her, and I used the example. Well, I didn't. One of the others brought it up, and I think it was a Hindu, said, but Jesus said to her, go and sin no more, because the crowd disappeared, and the crowd then were not able to judge her, and Jesus said, well, as the crowd don't judge you, neither do I. But he gave her the little hint, but go and sin no more.
Sure.
So, look, I think we're on the verge, given all the negatives of mass non-Western migration into the West, that we can all learn.
Look, it's interesting, and if I think back over my time of going to school, even interactions with the Indigenous culture, it's like anything else. It softens as the generations go through, and it gets to a point where we're not looking at colour or race or what happened to me or what happened to my family way back when, and I deserve and I need. It is moreover, well, what do we need to do today to all live happily together?
And this is why if anyone takes the time to listen to two voices on this topic, Jacinta Price and Warren Mundine, you will hear the most balanced, professional and passionate view, but not the way that was put forward by Noel Pearson or by Marcia Langton. Because really, if you read what they said, they're the racists.
Well, we're getting into the final 5 minutes of the program, David, and were there any conclusions that you got to at this conference?
Yes, the conclusions were everything that I'd said, not just I, but others said, is right. And that's the main reason why voices of reason should continue to shout, should continue to build up. If these religions are legitimate, they all have common thing. One, a belief in a superhuman being. We call it God.
Sure.
Hindus call it Rama. And Jews call it Jehovah. And, of course, Muslims call it Allah. Now, so we all accept a superhuman being. And the second thing is that all of these, as I said, I've read the Quran, I've read the Bible. Twice I've read the Bible. I've read the Book of Mormon. I've read the writings of Guru Nanak, who is the head of the Sikh Foundation. And I know just Christianity fits all. And all of them preach acceptance of a superhuman being or a supreme being. And the second thing is love your fellow man.
Let me pose this question.
So therefore, just to answer you, the drive was no matter how hard it is, no matter how cynical, and the cynics only come mainly from atheists, but no matter how cynical, don't give up, don't stop.
Look, I'll pose this question, and it seems to be not only shrouded in religion, but it's shrouded in our political system. And look, to a point, I'm having a good poke here at our journalistic system. What would happen if we just talked about the positive, and if there was some negative, we provided a very balanced approach in both sides of the equation for us, the listener, to decide how we felt about it, as opposed to, and today's hurrah that I heard on the television and had to turn it off is, the Prime Minister bought a $3 million house. And I'm thinking to myself, for heaven's sake.
Yes.
But anyway, the positive, right?
So to me, in journalism, the drive should be on check your facts, do your research. Don't, if you're of left mind or right mind, push all of that out. Do the research on the topic that you're going to do articles on or speak on. And then when you do that, be honest.
And I think that's the point. It's the same with religion. If we focused on those religious leaders who were talking positively, as opposed to those ones who were talking negatively, and it's not just one religion. The Ku Klux Klan is a Christian association.
Yes, bias leads good men and women to do disgraceful things. Bias leads good men and women to just punch a right-wing line or a left-wing line and conveniently ignore facts that seem to show that they're wrong. So going back to it, you just touched on it. The Prime Minister, whether you hate the Labor Party and whether you even dislike the man, he's entitled, given the income that he earns, it's a $4.3 million house. Now, I've heard the pontificating about how he shouldn't have because so much trouble people getting into housing. That's true. But why should he not? Oh, because he must set an example.
This is my frustration.
Yes.
Channel 9 and Channel 7, that was the only focus. I flip over to the ABC and they went through Liberal and Labor ministers and how many houses they
Yes,
owned.
yes.
And both sides of the fence seem to be well-to-do.
Yes, well, they are, and they're entitled to buy.
But it was nice to actually see a journalistic group going, well, this is the Liberal lot, this
Yes.
is the Labor lot.
Yes.
Don't you think that if you work hard in this country, you're entitled to buy
Of
things
course.
that you can afford?
And
of course you can.
Knowing that he was brought up by a single mother in the housing estates in Sydney.
30 seconds to round up our conversation
Well, I
today.
think we've rounded it up, haven't we? Journalism, they're hard battles in life, but they're not unwinnable. But the good has to rise to the surface, not that which separates us.
David Ashton Lewis, thank you very much for your time this morning.
You're more than welcome.
You've been listening to 4CRB's interviews and talkback series. Support local online content and become a financial supporter today at 4CRB.com.